All right, so let me then turn towards the idea of art as representation. Now, this idea that art is representation, this is maybe one of the most, if not the most, classical idea of art. It's certainly what we saw with the idea of mimesis, right, with Plato and Aristotle. Within the Greek tradition, you see this within indigenous traditions. Really, it's what most art was understood as consisting in on a rather basic level up until about the 18th century. We saw this with Beardsley. And um, Deutsch is not going to say, no, art is not representation. It's not that it's not imitation. Rather, what he's going to do is he's going to try to say, look, you look at this, imitation or representation is essential to art being what it is. The problem is representation is not that simple, and it's not all that there is to art. Let me explain. If we want to say that what you're trying to do when you're trying to talk about art is to create some sort of representation, some kind of mimesis of whatever it is that you're working on, we immediately have a problem with that. And one of the problems is that there is such a vast array of representations, of ways of making representations, that it's really hard to know exactly what representation is, at least if you want to reduce it down to something. I mean, when we represent some object in a painting or in a sculpture or in a dance or in music, what are we doing? Are we trying to imitate it? Are we trying to copy it? Are we trying to make an ideal realization of it the way we did with Plato and to some extent Kant, I guess? Are we trying to recognize how our feelings are and imitate our feelings in relation to it? Are we going for verisimilitude, getting it exactly right like a photograph? I mean, what exactly are we doing? Even the variations within the mediums make that almost impossible. I don't know how you're supposed to get a dance that's based on the, I don't know, the nature of a mountain range to copy that mountain range, and yet it certainly wants to represent, the themes within the mountain range. Um, how do you do that? What exactly is it that's going on with this representation? It's it's hard to say because representation doesn't really boil down to any one thing, right? Um, so what is it that's happening with this representation? Well, one of the things that Deutsch points out, he says, when you have this representation as an artist, it's not exactly that representation is a particular thing. The mediums make these changes of too much variation within that. The cultures make too many variations within that. But there is something that's always commonly going on. And you know what that is? That there's an artist. And that artist is using his or her artistic capacity to participate in the sort of spiritual vitality of the thing. So let's take this example I was giving right here. It's talking about a dance that's called, let's call it Cascades or Sierra Nevada or something like that. And you say, well, how could a dance possibly imitate mountains? Well, I don't think it's going to imitate mountains in that you're going to try to make your body shaped like mountains. Maybe you do. It's probably not going to be a very good dance then. And you're still not going to look much like a mountain. But if there are ways in which the dancer tries to embrace, say, the sense of what it's like to move as trees move when they are blowing in the wind on high up by the timberline, or what it is like to be present physically in the midst of the quiet of the early morning, or to imitate the rise of and fall of sunlight upon these high craggy rocks, or any of these things. Well, this is imitation, but it's imitation that comes through a participation in the spiritual vitality of the concept of the thing, right? Whatever that is. And you'll note, too, that's always set within the culture. It's always set within the way the person and the culture, the artist, that is, and the culture understand, participate, engage with the nature of whatever they're trying to represent. When I represent something as an artist, I'm representing my sense of it, not my perception of it, but my sense of it. And this is going to mean something pretty important for Deutsch. What it's going to mean is that representation, imitation, requires creative imagination. It requires the artist to have creative imagination. Now, you might say, okay, I guess I sort of kind of knew that already. But let me say a little bit about what that means, creative imagination. Because if on one hand it seems obvious, you think a little more about it, it seems kind of counterintuitive, at least as far as the way in which we often think about representation. A lot of times when we think about representation, like, and especially representation the way it's discussed in terms of technology. So representation the way, I don't know, a camera makes a mechanism for representing a photo image, right? Where it takes in the light impresses upon a certain chemical field, whether it's computer screen or silver oxide or whatever it is, makes the imprint on it. Well, that's sort of an analog way of making a representation, and that's not what we're talking about here. The mind of the artist, the soul of the artist, is never passive. Even if it's receptive, it's never passive in relation to the spiritual vitality within which it participates, right? Instead, what happens is the artist brings a creative imagination, a way of representing a way of being in the mind, and then finds a way to participate in it. But this participation is special. For participation, for this creative imagination's participation, you got to have a few things. For one thing, you have to have an element of freedom with regard to what is being imagined. That is to say, there has to be a way in which the artist allows the qualities of the thing, whatever it may be in their mind, to come together, represent, and manifest. So, what's an example for you? Well, I remember, actually, and this is sort of almost a trite example, but I remember one of my professors when I was an undergrad teaching me aesthetics, dear old Frank Nelson. And he was telling me a story about this idea of representation. He was saying, he was taking an art class and drawing class. And in the drawing class, one of the things that he was supposed to do was to draw a tree. They went outside and they drew a tree. Pretty typical exercise, I guess. And he said that about halfway through it, he realized he wasn't drawing the tree. He was drawing what he thought a tree was supposed to look like. In other words, he had this pattern in mind of what a tree was supposed to be, and he started, just drawing that or trying to draw that. And the tree didn't look anything like not only did it not look like the tree that he was observing, it didn't really look much like a tree. It looked like someone thought a tree was supposed to look like, and that's about it. Well, in the same sort of way that when Frank Nelson did this, and the drawing ended up not really being much of a work of art, so it is that when any artist doesn't allow the integrity, the structure of whatever it is that they're dealing with to come together and be what it is, that's when art begins to fail. The different parts of it in the creative imagination have to come together freely. They have to come together on their own accord. Okay? So, the creative imagination has to participate in the spiritual vitality of the object. It has to be free towards the object to allow the different integrity of the object to come together. At the same time, there's a way in which the artist also has to be free themselves in some sense. That is to say that there has to be a recognition, and I think actually a creative working together of the different elements of the mind. Artists have to tap into all these different aspects of themselves, their moods, their memories, their beliefs, their intuitions, their phobias, their aspirations, right? One of the things that makes art so interesting is just how profoundly human it is, how much it marks this process together in some way in the creation. And the interesting thing is, in the same way that you can often find, I think, a great deal of very good art in an artist who is, for lack of a better word, flawed. I think the reason why that happens is that there's a sense in which, while the artist may be flawed, if they can bring those flaws, allow those flaws to be present in the construction of the work itself can have a kind of dignity to it. Not because the artist is so capable and powerful and genius and all these other sorts of things, but I think rather because there's something that is working in the construction, in the creative imagination, that allows that representation, that imitation that the artist is participating in, allows it to work as a real dignified thing. So there's a sense in which I think, I mean, it's almost a truism, I guess, that sometimes artists can be some of the most, passionate and hyperbolic people, if you like, dramatic people. But I think that I hesitate to make too much out of that. I think it's pretty easy to fall into stereotypes pretty quickly with that aren't all that helpful. But there is certainly something to it. And if I had to ask, well, why is that? I think because it's something where it can, the problems and the disruptions and the traumas and the aspects of ourself that we don't have access to, that pop up out of our subconscious or whatever, or our past. These are things that, in the act of the artist, in his or her creative imagination, they have an opportunity to find a kind of new dignity. Not even really so much in the person, but in the work of art, right? And in the freedom of the work of art. I would say that there is, in addition to the sort of the rightness of the expression that's going on, or of the rightness of the of the representation that's going on, for a work of art for Deutsch. There's also a way in which the work of art is an expression of the self. So this distinction that sometimes happens with art, well, is it imitation or is it expression? This is really a false dichotomy. When the artist imitates, when the artist represents, it's a kind of expression because it involves this creative imagination. It involves participating, the artist bringing themselves forward, participating in the spiritual vitality of the object, allowing the freedom of its integrity to come together, bringing all these dimensions of him or herself and engaging in it, coming to know with it, working with these possibilities and parts of it, right? And allowing for a kind of expression to emerge from that. So it's expressive. The representation is an expression. It's an expression of the creative imagination, right, within a particular medium, and is inseparable and inexorable from the process of expression, something we'll talk about next.